Titanic, a tragedy that unfolded in the middle of an icy sea in April 1912, taking many of the 1,500 lives left aboard to the bottom of the Atlantic, still captivates our minds more than a century later. Perhaps it is the horror of being trapped on a sinking ship that terrifies us, or the idea that something thought to be unsinkable could be disputed so easily by the sea. Imagine you are on the deck of the Titanic as the last lifeboat is launched, cold and wet, and surrounded by people who would perish momentarily. What would you do? For one of my relatives who sailed on the Titanic, she made an epic final decision, but couldn't escape the curse of the Titanic. Annie Jane Jermyn was born July 13, 1885, in County Cork, Ireland. Her father, Henry, was the older brother of my great-great-grandfather, William, making Annie my great-grandmother's first cousin. However, the two girls were born on different continents. Henry Jermyn married Susan Connell in Ireland in 1880, and while they arrived in the United States in 1883, they soon returned to Ireland due to the death of Henry's mother, and it is there that the rest of their 10 children were born. In the 1911 Irish census, Annie was working as a servant for the Stewart family at Rosnelly House, along with her younger brother Henry. I honestly feel like I could write a novel about what her experience in this elegant home in the Irish countryside might have been. But her future prospects were slim. Who might she find to marry tucked away as a servant for this family? Or would she serve them till her dying day? In 1912, 26-year-old Annie purchased a third-class ticket for the Titanic and was planning to join her sister Mary in the U.S. Mary emigrated to the U.S. in 1910 and had recently married Richard Draper, also an Irish immigrant, and was living in Massachusetts. Annie left Rosnelly House for the last time and boarded the Titanic at Queenstown, Ireland on April 11, 1912. She shared a cabin with 2 other Irish girls, Bridget Driscoll and Mary Kelly. While first and second-class accommodations were unparalleled on the Titanic, Annie's third-class accommodations were less noteworthy. First-class passengers had exquisitely designed rooms and dined on 3 meals a day, featuring oysters and lobster. Meanwhile, Annie had a bunk bed and was given 2 meals a day, with gruel being one of the menu items. Third-class passengers had separate decks and parlors from first- and second-class passengers, but a rousing party was held in steerage the evening before the disaster, with pounding Irish drums, a farewell party for most. I expect that Annie was used to feeling of a lower class, having worked as a servant, and was excited just to be a passenger on the largest ship in the world, and with all the possibilities that life in America might hold, until her third-class status became a matter of life and death. Around midnight on April 14, 1912, Annie was awakened by a rumbling and grinding of metal, which brought the steerage passengers out into the corridor. While they tried to make sense of what was happening, the hallways began to fill with water. Pandemonium ensued. Annie ran to the 10-foot gates which normally barred third-class passengers from the first- and second-class decks, but were now condemning them to death. Men and women pounded on the gates, pleading for their lives in their native tongue. Unlike first-class passengers who were ushered to the upper decks, third class was left to their own devices to get to the boat deck, as the crew was unwilling to break class protocol. After 2 hours, and with the water steadily rising, Annie watched a man jump up and grab the top of the gate and pull himself up. She managed to climb over the gates and ran up several flights of stairs to the upper decks. As she stood in the cold of night, with bare feet and only her nightgown on, she was never invited to board one of the half-empty lifeboats that were being lowered. By this time, the boats were no longer reserved for women and children. As the last collapsible lifeboat was lowered, Annie realized this was her only chance to survive. She leapt off the deck, falling 30 feet before landing on the edge of the raft. She was then struck on the back by a man who also jumped off the ship in a moment of desperation, who was then shot by the officer commanding the raft, falling back into a deep, dark, icy grave. Annie was helped into the lifeboat, suffering injuries to her chest and stomach from the fall. Many women later claimed to have been on the last lifeboat, to appear brave and less concerned with self-preservation. But for Annie, Had this not been a collapsible lifeboat, the fall alone may have killed her, and she too may have slid into the depths. Annie was likely in tremendous pain as she sat with the others in darkness, as the Titanic slowly sank beneath the eerily calm sea. As they listened to the cries of those who entered the icy waters, which was described as the high-pitched hum of locusts on a midsummer's night. But the frigid waters quieted them quickly. After what must have felt like an endless nightmare, daybreak came with an unexpected beauty. At 7:15 a.m., Annie's lifeboat reached the Carpathia, the first ship to respond to the Titanic's final distress calls, ultimately saving 705 lives. 2 more agonizing days later, Annie arrived in New York and was taken to the hospital, where she was treated for her injuries, before finally reaching her sister's house in Massachusetts on April 28th. Annie did several interviews, and her account appeared in newspapers in the U.S. and Europe, one of only a few reports from third-class passengers. The treatment of third-class passengers, who were forced to stay below deck until the final lifeboats were launched, was mostly overlooked by the media, and later by Congress, which conducted an investigation and found no wrongdoing in how the disaster was handled. However, the fact remains that 76% of third-class passengers died, compared to 38% of first class. By the time Annie reached her sister Mary's house, she was traumatized. Annie stayed with Mary until the rest of the Jermyn family arrived in the U.S. in August 1912, at which time she moved in with her parents. According to the book The Irish Aboard the Titanic, which included an interview with Annie's niece around the year 2000, Annie met a man that the family did not approve of and disappeared with him. Supposedly, Annie's sister Betty tracked her down in 1934 and said she was living in New Jersey and refused to attend their mother's funeral, and never contacted the family again. However, there is not one single public record of Annie in the United States. She never appears in the U.S. Census or any city directories in Massachusetts or New Jersey. She never married, she never had children, and apparently she never died. It is as if she died on the Titanic and only her ghost arrived in New York. The Jermyn family eventually came to tell people that Annie died in the Titanic, because for them, that was the day they lost the woman they knew. Many Titanic survivors reported misfortune after the tragedy. Financial ruin, divorce, and personal loss all plagued them, and was likely amplified by the tremendous emotional toll of the disaster. Annie's disappearance from public records leaves many questions and does not bode well for a happily ever after. Did she end up in a mental institution? Did she come to some harm, perhaps at the hands of her disreputable suitor, and was never identified upon her death? Did she become homeless, which may explain her absence from public records? Or is her marriage certificate safely tucked away in a dusty American archive, shrouding the details of a happy, quiet life? Perhaps more time will uncover the secrets of Annie's life and death, or perhaps she never escaped the curse of the Titanic.